Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about crime and criminal justice. Of course, when we approach this subject, we almost have to take a biopsychosocial approach because we have to understand the biological components, such as the way your body functions, hunger drives, thirst drives, all of these things that might lead you to steal, for example. Then you have the psychological element, your cognitions, emotions, motivations, brain functioning. How is your brain functioning compared to the average brain, etc. And then the sociological component is going to be looking at the effect of society, groups of people, and institutions within society, such as the economy, the criminal justice system itself. You're looking at the family, you're looking at culture. So a lot of these institutions are also associated with crime and criminal justice. But again, when we're asking what is a crime, we have to look at, of course, deviance, and deviance being defined as violating social norms. We have to ask what constitutes something that violates social norms that needs to be formally recognized with laws, regulations, policies, strict cultural rules that structure our behavior so that we don't commit actions that deviate from the functioning of the group. And of course, how we label something as a crime is completely abstract, but again, it's based upon our cultural value systems, our ideologies of what's appropriate. For example, you can't pick up a sword and run around and engage in violent acts in our modern times, but if we were Vikings, would we not have taught our children to pick up swords and hop on ships and go over to England and engage in that historical time? So again, what is labeled a crime, of course, is based upon social perspectives. It's based upon the time frame, the epoch we're talking about. It's also based upon social functioning, whether or not it causes social problems, for example. Because humans, again, we all have these violent tendencies. Otherwise, there would not be war, there would not be abuse and violence. However, we need society to regulate a lot of our behavior. For example, when we ask what's the purpose of having social norms, what's the purpose of having crimes, we have to look at it in terms of, people are engaging in behaviors that are not appropriate for group behavior and for a proper functioning of society, such as rape and abuse. And so again, we need some rules, some regulations to restrict, to regulate human behavior. And so again, you're having these social institutions that are regulating the psychological human behaviors in the individuals. But again, we have to ask what is necessary and what's not. And then, of course, crime should be continuously evaluated for relevance, making sure that it makes sense to have in our society. For example, it was illegal for two men to get married, in prior decades. And so over time, though, we've questioned the legitimacy of those rules, and we've asked whether or not they're relevant to our culture in modern times. So again, crime itself is based upon what society labels as deviant. And then we have institutions such as the criminal justice system, including the police and the courts, that manage, human behavior when it deviates from what is deemed socially acceptable. We also have to think about other sociological variables associated with crime besides culture, and we have to look at things like socioeconomic status. How is poverty associated with crime? We have to look at factors in your culture, such as value systems. Do you think crime is normal? You again have to look at it, in terms of what time frame we're talking about. You also have to look at it with reference to biological factors. So again, how much of biology, these motivations from our body, our genes, our hormones, are driving us towards some actions that can be deemed criminal, such as violence and abuse. But again, you have to recognize that 1 out of 3 women experience sexual violence, and I think it's something like 1 out of 5 children experience physical violence. So again, child abuse, how much of that is just, biology, parents are tired, things along those lines? How much of it's just a culture that we're expected to hit kids if they step out of line? And then in modern times, is even spanking appropriate is extremely questionable, and it's a good debate in sociology. But again, we're in for social problems, so we have to be asking, is crime a social problem and why? And again, crime is a social problem when society labels it a social problem. Whether or not something is a crime and if it's is socially labeled, socially constructed, people in society get together and decide what's acceptable and what is not acceptable. And that is how we begin to label things of crime. And then we also make the decisions of how to sanction those crimes. Do we use civil penalties? Do we use, prison systems and county jails and probation systems? What's the best way to deal with certain crimes? But again, if we look at the statistics, we find that there are over 10 million crimes committed every year in the United States. So obviously there has always been an extensive crime problem. But the official statistics only report what is reported. So again, we have 10 million reported crimes. I think it was in 2020 or 2021. And then you have to look at it, that's, how many more were engaged in that, weren't reported. And so I put a picture from your book here that talks about violent crime is committed every 24 seconds, property crime every 3 seconds, murder every 35 minutes, rape every 6 minutes, robbery every 1 minute, assault every 39 seconds, burglary 14, larceny 5, motor theft vehicle every 40 seconds. So again, crime is continuously happening in society. Is that to say that humans are naturally deviants and capable of committing crimes and things along those lines? The argument is humans are quite capable of doing all kinds of things. But again, that's why we need these rules and regulations to structure human behavior, because if people were running around murdering each other and breaking into each other's houses, would you be able to even sleep at night? How would you be able to protect your family? So again, we need some forms of social control, and when you get into deviance theory, you can get into things like control theory, that humans without control, is it anarchy, or are we all just like unicorns and happy and getting along? You got to look at how society would be. When I ask students that question, sometimes they would say it's something like the Purge, and I'd be like, I don't know if it's going to be like the Purge. Maybe it'll be a utopian society like Marx predicted. You never know. But seemingly this kind of thing happens. And humans, because, they have the ability to be violent as a species, will there always be war? And so when we get to things like war and terrorism a little later in this class, we'll delve more into that. So the types of crime, your book discusses it in terms of violent crimes such as murder, assault, rape, gang violence, and robbery. You also have property crime, you have corporate crime, organized crime, and juvenile delinquency. Okay, when you're thinking about property crime, you're thinking about damages, you're thinking about things along the houses, stealing, corporate crime, getting into stocks and frauds, organized crime, thinking about, the mafia, gang type of organization, and then juvenile delinquency, anybody under 18 that does not commit murder. Because the only crime that can be a juvenile, I think, can be charged as an adult is with the murder crime. Okay, and so if you look at crime by region, that's some of these graphs up here, it's interesting. You see the Northeast has the lowest amount, but is that because they have the most economically affluent part of the country? You have the Midwest and the West in similar numbers, and then you have higher rates in the South. Is that because of things like respect and access to guns and things like that in the South, or is that because the South is more poor than the North? So again, you might think that because the gun laws are more lax in the South, therefore there's higher crime or something, but maybe it's got nothing to do with gun laws and it has everything to do with the South as the poorest states. If you look at that graph and then you compare income by state for the United States, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, these states all have the lowest income of any other person in the United States. The variables for why somebody commits crime, a lot of it has to do with poverty, where you're born. A lot of it has to do with the culture you're exposed to. You can get into access theories that corporate crime is committed by people that are in the upper classes and have access to, white-collar crime, and then drugs and dealing and burglary and things along those lines are done more by the lower classes that don't have access to commit fraud. And then do people commit crimes because they're desperate, because they're poor, because they're angry, because they're violent? A lot of that you have to delve into the psychology of it all. Like, why did someone commit murder? Is it over because they're poor and they're dealing drugs and it's some gangland violence stuff and it's like street violence? Or is it domestic violence where somebody's angry? Okay? And so again, you can't take the social or the psycho out of crime, and you definitely need the biology to understand how our bodies are moving, how the neurons are firing, what kind of emotions happen when you're in these stressful situations. I mean, again, when you're talking about stress and emotions, you're getting a biological response, the psychology of the interpretations of your cognitions in your body, and the social environment that's associated with the way you behave. So again, very complex. Some good theories of crime, though. Again, biopsychosocial is my go-to with all sociology. We have to understand the body, the structure of the brain, the mind itself, and then the social context in order to understand anything. So again, with the biopsychosocial, you're looking at genetics, body functioning, brain functioning. With the psychological theories, you're looking at cognition and emotion and motivation, decision-making. And your sociological approaches. What's the purpose of committing crimes? What's the purpose of having laws? Are people committing crimes because they're poor, and it's the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie? Did we create a society where crime is acceptable, or the existence and opportunity to commit crimes exist, and therefore that's the reason we have it, for symbolic interactionism? And then Merton's strain theory is excellent, because strain theory not only looks at the psychological factors associated with it, like the stress, the cognitions, the emotions, and that type of strain, but also the strain due to economic factors such as poverty, okay? And Merton's strain theory is fun. It breaks it down into conformity. Again, if you grow up into a place where crime is normal, you're not going to think it's abnormal. It's just the normal way of life. Innovation in order to get goals, ritualism, that it's a cultural way of life, retreatism to avoid, and then rebellion to be counterculture. Very interesting approach. With the criminal justice system, of course, we're looking at police, courts, the death penalty, prison, the industrial complex, racism, ethnocentrism, sexism, classism are all involved, targeting is involved. So when you're thinking about the criminal justice system, again, you're talking about the institutions that we made to structure the behavior of people and to enforce the laws and to protect. Okay, so you have governments that give the police the sanctioned, legitimate authority to go out and engage in the activities dictated by the government that the police should engage in based upon certain regulations. Then you have the criminal justice system with your prosecutors and your defenders that are trying criminals, and the judges oversee those cases along with the jury if it's not a judge trial. You'll get a lot more of that in your other classes, of course. How we punish crimes, the laws that state, how long a crime is punishable up to, and the minimum and the maximum rates of that crime are again determined by the government and determined by the courts. And there's a ton of oversights based upon the level of courts to make sure that these laws are constitutional and being enforced. And then you have all the constitutional laws that, talk about factors like double jeopardy, talk about, cruel and unusual punishment, excessive fines, etc. So we have a ton of case law to support the social construction of institutions that structure the enforcement of laws and the protection of people. And then we pay taxes, into our taxes to, run these institutions. So again, to think about, and then the prison systems, the jails then house the people. And historically they were government run, but in modern times the jails, the corporations are private industries that work for profit. And so again, in order to maximize profits, they need to have a certain amount of inmates at any given time. And so then you have to look into, there's some much larger sociological questions here, like who do the police actually work for? Are they just enforcing the laws of the bourgeoisie, or are they considering the laws of all society and the needs of all people? You have to consider, police treatment of minorities throughout history. You have to consider police as saving graces and saving all of us in times of need, and why we need those police. So sorry, I was in a classroom. Sometimes the timer goes off. So again, this whole idea of do we need all of this bureaucracy? Do we need all these agents of socialization in play to regulate behavior is a really good question. And how should that system be run? And that's definitely the realm of sociology. So again, you can see that there's several institutions involved with the criminal justice system, again, from the police to the court systems to the prison systems. But again, are they associated in the judgments associated in how long we sentence people based upon factors like race and sex? Absolutely. If you were to look at case sentencing and you control for biological sex or gender, what you're going to find is women get more lenient sentences than men. If you compare whites to African Americans, you see the similar thing. Whites tend to get more lenient sentences than African Americans. And that's because that system is also influenced by the culture of America, which was historically racist. So that implicit, often unconscious bias exists in the minds of judges and prosecutors and police and attorneys across the board. And so, of course, the influence of racist and ethnocentric viewpoints have penetrated the psychology of those that are responsible for implementing the criminal justice system. And then you also have to think about targeting. To wrap it up, we're thinking about solutions of crime. Of course, from a functionalist perspective, we're going to be examining whether the laws that we've socially constructed are appropriate. We're going to be asking what's the purpose of crime and how can we better enforce it. From a conflict approach, again, we're questioning the laws and we're asking who do the laws work for? How can we help those in poverty to live a better life so they can overcome crime? And symbolic interactionist approach, of course, is looking at the idea that we're the ones who create society, and it is us who create a society where crime is possible, and we're the ones who manage crime. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.